Hi again, Tavo. It's me, your regular critic. so, I just uploaded another video a little while ago that I'd actually recorded a week ago about basically a response to some of your comments. But I thought I'd just go ahead while it's on my mind because it's been kind of bugging me about your response to MrDeity. And I don't know if he's going to do a response at all. He may or may not. But your response really, in my opinion, flopped. And I'll tell you why. I mean, yes, obviously, he only addressed one of your arguments. That was his entire point. He wasn't trying to address the rest of them. So whether he addressed the rest of them or not is basically irrelevant. I'm going to quickly address your other 9 arguments, and then I'm going to get to why I think your response to him flops. And it's the other 9 unaddressed arguments. The early secondary sources, this one. So what? The early secondary sources are still decades to hundreds of years later. And don't forget, even though scholars may think that, and probably with some justification believe that many of these documents were written fairly early, most of the texts, or many of the texts, especially of the Gospels and of Paul's writing, we have virtually nothing of until the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. For example, the fragment of Paul is not until the first, P92, I think, isn't until the late 200s. P52 of John isn't, it's a credit card size fragment from the early 2nd century. And so these early secondary sources are claimed. They may be justifiably so, by scholars. I will generally accept their recommendations, but the actual documentation of those sources comes decades, actually, really, multiple decades, because first one is 70 plus years afterwards. Really, it's a stretch. And also, it doesn't matter whether or not they're closer to the source, the time period, than other religious figures. That is not a criterion that determines how accurate something is. Something could have been recorded by a witness literally the day after, and it still doesn't make it true. That is not a criterion that points to how true something is. We know from today, from January 6th, 2020, that within 24 hours, during one of the most easily documented periods of human history, cell phones and video cameras and everything everywhere, people were believing false things about that within 24 hours, despite massive amounts of evidence to the contrary. And yet you seem to think that somehow people back then were different? No, I'm sorry, that argument fails. Your early creedal evidence, I go back to the same thing. The first letter of, the fragment of Paul's letter we have is from the late 2nd century. We don't have any complete versions of his letters until the 3rd and 4th centuries. So this creedal form, this resurrection, Paul's letters don't even speak necessarily of what kind of resurrection Jesus had. What was the form of it? Was it spiritual? Was it a physical body? Was it a new body? So, and immediately after his death, no, that's something that only Christian apologists say. No scholar. I mean, no, not Bergerman, maybe Habermas and apologists. Only apologists will make that kind of claim. That is not something that scholars will say immediately after. You need to define what is immediately after. Weeks, days. Again, so what? January 6th, 2020 disproves that entire point all on its own. The qualitative character of early testimony, the appeal to living witnesses. You think people back then really were able to just pick up and say, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to take some PTO and I'm going to go travel around and I'm going to try to verify this stuff. Really? Come on. What kind of a criterion is this? This is nonsense. This is not based on the reality of first century, Judea, Jerusalem, anything. No. So what if they invited you? I mean, that's what you would say. Of course, hey, you can go look for yourself. Like people do that today. Do you think people back then were fact checking any more than they are now? Come on, Tavo. Don't be silly. People don't even fact check now. You think they did back then? So what? That doesn't prove anything. publicly verifiable historical events. Yeah, which ones? Yeah, so what if, you had some people that listed a few historical events, yet other accounts from other people that listed historical events, that to help justify and place and ground their events as well. There's nothing unique about that. How soon it is after still doesn't make a difference as to how accurate it is and how true it is. Um, this cross-religious sanctification of Jesus, I'm just going to, I don't know why you think this has any meaning whatsoever, because seriously, how do you think that this proves anything? What? I don't care about your data-driven, your p-values and stuff like that. How does that prove anything? It means that people believe things. As I said in my video that I released earlier today, so a lot of people believe things, and then even in other religions, they have some things that they think are pretty cool about Jesus. Wow, that just means that they kind of believe some things. That doesn't prove that it's true. Nonsense. It just doesn't. Um, Hostile source attestations. They attested to Jesus's miraculous acts. I'm sorry, really? It says, Josephus, the Testimonium Flavianum says he performed amazing works. Tacitus said a few things. No, there's really not a whole lot there. And do we have any proof that actual miracles and magic happen today? No? Yeah, not really. I mean, I haven't seen a single good attestation documented miracle because magic doesn't work. This is the real world we live in. We don't live in a world where magic spells work, where prayers call down fire from heaven and magically heal people. No, that doesn't work. It's doctors who heal people. Either that or just like regression to the mean, like you know, uh, I'm drawing a blank on the term, but things where just things start healing spontaneous remission. So miraculous acts. I'm sorry, we have no evidence that miraculous acts really happen. And especially not by, okay, David Copperfield made the entire Statue of Liberty disappear. That's pretty darn impressive. But guess what? That's not a magic act. That's just an act. It's not a miracle. It's a heck of a lot more impressive than anything Jesus claimed to do in the Bible. So why aren't you saying, hey, maybe David Copperfield's the Messiah? This is a silly criterion. This proves nothing. And also, just the hostile attestation. Again, so what? People who are hostile to Jesus said he claimed to do some things, or people who followed him claimed to do some things. You're really, really stretching this claim of what these other people claimed that Jesus actually did. And they just claimed that he did it. They didn't actually have any proof that he did it. But again, it's just a claim. That doesn't count. Jesus in the canonical Jewish literature performing miracles. Wow, so what? Again, until you can demonstrate that miracles happen and that magic can happen, so what? I don't care if he's the only person or the 50th person. That doesn't say whether or not those claims are true. Until you can demonstrate that miracles happen and that the supernatural exists and that the will of God can be affected. And I'm sorry, like when somebody, is confronting a police officer in her own home and she rebukes the police officer in the name of Jesus, and then the police officer shoots her in the face, as happened just last year. I'm sorry, I don't have any reason to believe that the power of Jesus or the power of Jesus' name has any effect on anything in the real world. God, if it does, God seems to be really particular about who he does this for. That seems like that woman was pretty much in need of Jesus's help right then, and she got shot in her face in the kitchen in front of her child. God's miraculous works, am I right? Yeah. Second temple changes. Josephus, he said, are you actually trying to talk about the Testimonium Flavianum as being anything? Second Temple Judaism made some changes. Can you demonstrate that they wouldn't have happened without Jesus? That they were specifically because of Jesus? No, you can't. I'm sorry. That, again, doesn't prove anything. Rapid early spread. You don't actually have evidence of this. We've talked about this. Very, very small. There might have been 10% of the entire Roman Empire population that was Christian before Theodosius actually legalized it or made it the legal national, um, the legal religion of the empire. At which point, yes, we absolutely do know that it started spreading by the sword, by mass conversions, forced conversions, pogroms. You know, just if you weren't Christian, you lost out big time. So to claim that Christianity entirely spread by just in these leaps and bounds is simply not justified. No, you cannot justify that. You don't have good sources on that. Um, Enemies as martyrs, again, so what? So what if he's the only one who has that? Does that in any way prove that he was actually divine? It just proves that some people who didn't like him then switched their minds. We also don't actually have a whole lot of evidence of what James really believed before or after. We don't have really his own words, and about what happened. What Paul claims, I realistically think Paul was a grifter. I think he was basically nothing more than a con man who saw an opportunity, like preachers do today. Like Kenneth Copeland, I think his name is. No, like that's no, that was the American composer. But these mega church pastors, that gets. So what if he was persecuted? He was basically gained a huge following. He ended up creating Christianity, really, because most Christians don't follow Jesus; they follow Paul. That's just a fact. All right, that's enough of that. Now let's get to your response to Mr. Deity's argument. And this one, I think that point just whooshed right over your head. Just right, especially when you talk about this. Jesus should have had, omniscient Jesus should have had warned people. And canonic theology, I'm sorry, I've been reading about Christian theology and stuff for decades, and I've never even heard of that one. So I'm sorry, that's like pulling that out of the hat. That's just moving the goalpost because you never specified exactly what that was, about until you got to like, oops, oh, I got to have an excuse for how do I get around this. It's like, oh yeah, there's canonic theology, which means that Jesus may not have actually had all of his omniscience. Well, if you don't possess all of the attributes of God, then you're no longer God. That's the law of identity. You have to be identical and have all the same properties. Sorry, you just invalidated Jesus as God. Um, Canonic theology is not by any wild stretch of the imagination something that the large swaths of Christianity hold to. No, I mean, I had you listening to online, conversation, and Christians are absolutely saying that Jesus was both fully divine and fully human. And yes, he really did know everything, except somehow he didn't know the day or the hour. Oh well, figure that one out. Um, but yeah, the canonic theology, that's moving the goalposts. Fail, bad Tavo, fail. um, the creator argues that, just whether it's theologically falsifiable. I'm sorry, is God really theologically falsifiable? No, he's not. That's why nobody's actually been able to actually prove him. You're having to stretch and find these crazy, weird, data-driven things that don't actually prove anything about God to try to prove God. um, the addressment, the part about when Mr. Deity was talking about the omniscience of Jesus, you just completely missed that. You did not address that properly at all. You did not. The whole point is that Jesus is omniscient, and a perfectly good, perfectly just, perfectly moral God would not be able to tolerate the kinds of things that he would know would happen because he was not clear, knowing because that would be his fault, because he failed to make it clear what he really thought about slavery and misogyny and any number of trans, gay, LGBTQ issues, because he failed to actually make any of that clear. He knew that his name would be used to justify atrocities, and he did nothing about it. Also, bear in mind, the whole free will argument that Christians always really want to try to build up. Isn't it weird how he never, ever respects the free will of the abused, the victims? Only the free will of the powerful, mighty, conquering armies that Christianity sent across the globe. Yeah. Sorry, that just, the whole point is Jesus was God. Jesus was God in the Old Testament too. Jesus would, the Son and the Father are always of one mind. So that means Jesus can't disagree with God because, they can't disagree because they're one and the same God. They can't disagree. That would be, just like an impossibility. So that means Jesus was perfectly fine with the atrocities in the Old Testament. He was fine with the atrocities in the Old Testament. He was fine with the fact that he failed to lay out clear moral teachings that we now believe today, that slavery is wrong, that misogyny is wrong, that LGBTQ issues are really, really important because they are human beings too. That God failed. Complete omission. He failed to even try to prevent humans from committing such a trial. He could have said, instead of don't eat shellfish, he could have said, don't ever own people as slaves. Instead of saying, don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, he could have said, hey, women are equal to men in rights in all ways. They just have some different capabilities, but they're of equal value. And don't treat them like property either. He could have said, people with different skin colors are of equal value. He could have done any of those things, but instead he talked about shellfish and mixed fabrics and a whole bunch of other stuff that's in those 613 laws of the law of Moses that you don't actually know. You failed to know, and that's what Justin, again, as I mentioned in my earlier video, Justin clearly made it obvious that you don't know your Old Testament and you don't even know the basis of your claim that Jesus was a unique, moral, advanced philosopher. No, he wasn't, because that unique, advanced moral philosopher was perfectly fine with the atrocities in the Old Testament. He's perfectly fine with not saying a single thing that could have even tried to prevent any of the atrocities of the last 2,000 years, the genocides committed in God's name. He failed. And your argument does nothing, literally nothing, to refute that. Historical context, bullshit. Chattel slavery, Leviticus 25:44-46 talks about owning people as property that you can pass down to your children for life. That is chattel slavery. Don't try that. I mean, slavery apologetics is a really bad look, Tavo. Don't do that. I mean, don't be that disappointing and just apologetic. I mean, like I said, more and more, every one of these videos, you just convinced me more and more that you weren't an atheist. You didn't actually study these issues before you became a Christian, and now you're just using apologetic arguments. It's frustrating. You use this claim that I used to be an atheist, and I'm not really convinced now. But then you use these same apologetics about chattel slavery in America was different from the chattel slavery in the Old Testament. Maybe listen to some actual experts on that, because you're wrong. Jainism comparison. It can, oh yeah, this one. It cannot scale to a societal level. I'm sorry, can we say moving the goalposts again, Tavo? Did you ever claim that is one of your criteria for whether or not it's unique, advanced, and moral? No, you did not. Fail. Nope, throw it out. Moving the goalpost, not allowed. Nope, can't do that. And it doesn't matter if it's scalable, because if it's actually true and good and from an omnipotent God, it should be. The scalable model, I mean, your Jesus, his unique advanced moral philosophy obviously hasn't scaled to societal levels either, has it? Because people still use it to justify atrocities today, Tavo. And you can't use the no true Christian argument, because that's bullshit. That's just bull. So, also, I mean, who cares if there's less historical documentation? Again, I don't care. The fact is, it is there. And it is clearly superior to Jesus saying, bring all those who don't agree to follow me and put them before my feet and slaughter them with a sword. It's clearly better than when he said to the Samaritan woman, it's better to make sure that the children are fed before the dog. I mean, you don't know the Bible. You don't know the morality of the Jesus. You just have this idea of what's in it because of what's been preached, but it's not actually what's in the Bible. So I really don't care whether it's historically documented or not. That has nothing to do with whether or not it's true. How many documents were lost because Christianity just failed to print it or copy it because they didn't believe it was worth it, or that how much of it was that they destroyed? Because that all happened a lot too back then. So, how much survived has a little bit to do with how much effort was put into preserving it at a time when, it was a lot more difficult. So, your response to MrDeity was a total flop. It failed in every single aspect. There was not one point on which I think you came out ahead. I think you just utterly failed. Why don't you make a response video to me? Or let's have an online discussion. I'm going to be on spring break, next weekend. So the week after that, I'm going to be kind of away trying to refresh and recharge. But why don't we actually send up a video? I'm not going to be nice. I'm going to be harsh. I'm going to push back hard on your arguments, and I'm going to point out that they don't actually prove anything. That's the problem for you. They don't prove anything. So, yeah, you want to have an online talk? I would love to have one. I'm going to make you read the Bible. I'm going to make you justify all that stuff and demonstrate that no, your Jesus was not in any way a unique advanced moral philosopher. Oh yeah, and like the thing about, I saw something about the Matthew 5, part where Jesus, I come not to abolish but to fulfill. If he didn't come to abolish it, then he didn't abolish it. The law is still there. And if you go back to the Old Testament and what Yahweh says in the Old Testament will happen in the Messianic period, there will be Levitical priests offering sacrifices, burnt sacrifices, to God, and there will be someone of the line of David on the throne of Israel. So that argument fails. Jesus didn't come to abolish, and don't forget. Then later in 5, he talks about you must actually follow these laws to be considered great in the kingdom of heaven, teaching not to, bad, maybe you can still get to heaven, but you're not teaching it. You're not so good up there. And he says, you must be greater, you must be better than the Pharisees and the Sadducees in following the law. Don't do as they do because they're being hypocrites, but do what they teach. And they taught to follow the law. So again, you don't even know your Bible. Your arguments fall flat at every single point because you don't know your Bible, and because you don't know it, foundation of your argument on morality of Jesus as good and moral just fails. It's no good. All your other stuff, it's fluff because none of it proves anything. We know how people are. We know people are flawed and think things and believe things that are just wrong all the time. Even when they can fact check it, they don't. And you think people back then were any different? Of course they weren't. Sorry. Of course they weren't. So, yeah, get in touch. Late March, early April. I'd be glad to sit down and have a talk. Let me know.